at this for a long time, figuring out how technologies can best unleash students' limitless learning potential. So I failed a lot in the 35 years that I began researching the sweet spots between pedagogy and technology. The very first study I did, I'm a simple teacher. I'm a biology teacher. I was actually a systems biologist. That's what my training was in, is looking at whole ecosystems and looking at the interplay between all the elements, living and non-living, the biotic and abiotic factors in an ecosystem in my home state of New Jersey. And I'm actually from the South. I'm from South Jersey, which is a very different New Jersey. And I've carried that kind of mindset in thinking about whole system change and looking at schools as an ecosystem, a whole system where every part of that system is important. The very first study that I did was in 1984 at Rutgers University, where I was a graduate student, and the very first technology we looked at was the Apple IIe computer and a software called the Oregon Trail. Right. How many of you drowned in the Blue River? Well, the first study was not about the impact of technology on achievement, but the impact of technology on engagement, which is a funny little way of looking at this. Engagement, it's hard to define. It's hard to really wrap your mind around. And what we found was that students were immediately engaged in this experience of problem solving, a virtual trek across the country. But over a very short period of time, that interest dropped precipitously as kids got bored. They started to play the arcade game, which many of you probably did, and shooting game instead of actually solving the problem. So that roller coaster of inflated engagement, followed by a drop in engagement, followed by an inflation in engagement, then another drop, is a pattern I've seen play itself over and over again for the last 35 years. We shouldn't be looking at engagement, we should be looking at models of achievement, actual achievement and well-being. So let me talk about that. First I'd like you to do this. Do a thought experiment. And imagine what it would be like if you could double academic achievement and student well-being in your school. What would that look like? What are the indicators of success? How would you know if you're close? How would you know if you're there? Imagine is one of the most powerful forces that we have at our disposal as human beings. The next question is, how do you get there? And this is what I've spent most of my adult career studying. How do we unleash students' limitless learning potential with technology tools in a way that's simply not possible in the absence of those tools? So I've created a framework for innovation called the T3 Framework for Innovation. And it is a hierarchy, but it's also a continuum that is a synthesis of 35 years of failing better at solving this particular wicked problem. It's a wicked problem because it's ill-structured, it's ill-defined, and it's as yet unresolved. So before I dive into the framework, let me tell you that I'm a researcher. So fundamentally, I'm really interested in models of evidence. But there's actual 5 levels of evidence. The first level is personal experience. When you have some personal interaction with variables, and you think, okay, A leads to B. Well, that's not really very reliable, or it's not terribly valid because of the potential of error and bias, right? The next level is collective experience, and you also then get more than one person having the same experience, but you could entertain collective errors or collective bias. Not very generalizable, not really valid. The third level is actual scientific experimentation. Systematic observation, where you try to intentionally reduce errors and biases in order to ascertain the true nature of relationships. The fourth level is when you have not just one study, but dozens, hundreds of studies that show the same relationship. And the fifth level is the preponderance of evidence. And that's when we have thousands, tens of thousands of studies to purport the same relationship. So 5 levels of evidence, 5 levels of reliability. At the 5th level is a guy named John Hattie. How many of you know John Hattie's work? Okay, he's developed this effect size meter, which tells us the impact of influences from negative to low to medium to high, using this scale, the effect size scale. What I want you to do is take 15 seconds, turn to the person next to you and ask, what do you think is the impact of technology on student achievement? Okay, time's up. It's a good conversation to have, though. All right. In the purposes of time, in the sake of time, I'm going to have to, why don't I just tell you what the impact of technology is for Seinfeld fans? It's actually 0.34. The average is 0.4 of all the influences that Hattie studied. John looked at over 10,000 studies of various aspects of technology and education and found the average effect is 0.34. Technology's had a deleterious effect on student learning, and that effect size hasn't changed in 50 years. That's a clarion call. That should alarm us. So I want to figure out why, and I think I have. I think I know the reason why. I believe we've been engaged in a planar shift, moving along an x-axis, moving from an industrial age system of education to a digital age system of education, and all we've been doing is sprinkling technology on fundamentally an industrial age system. We've been moving along the x-axis. Think of it this way. We've taken a 20th century donut and added 21st century frosting. It's the same donut, and it's getting stale. I think we need an axial shift. Somebody tweet that. The donut's getting stale. I think we need an axial shift. We need a change in the axis. And by that I mean we need to shift our whole consciousness away from students memorizing old knowledge and move towards whole child and whole system mastery and well-being. That's not an ideological shift. That's not even a mechanistic shift. That's a shift in consciousness, moving towards that whole child, whole system mastery. And that's why I wrote this book, Disruptive Classroom Technologies, where I introduced the T3 framework for education. So let me talk about that. But first, let me summarize my research findings in a simple metaphor. I have a confession to make. I have a rock and roll heart. I love rock and roll. I'm a musician. Actually, I played with Ewan. Ewan was a great drummer. We jammed at Alan November's party several years ago. I can sum it up very simply with a rock and roll metaphor. When it comes to modern teaching and learning, high impact pedagogy is the melody. That's the basis, that's the background. High impact or high impact technology use adds the harmonies, and together you get great music. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I realized that, I'm going to tell you a little story now. In South Jersey, I taught myself how to play guitar when I was 14 years old. And I was very happy listening to the songs that I would hear on the radio and translating them onto my 6-string guitar. And at the time, in the 70s, so I was playing John Denver, America, the Eagles. I think I played Country Roads, maybe 300 times in my career. And then I heard, right? No, turn it up. I couldn't go back to Country Roads. You know, I was so disruptive of my thinking about musicianship and guitar playing. And I actually heard Eddie Van Halen on a radio station, and he said, if you're out there playing guitar, you're probably the kind of kid that's sitting around the campfire, strumming your 6-string. Keep doing that. But know that you're in a stage. And if you want to get better, you got to go through another stage that he said, I call that the Chuck Berry stage. You got to start rocking out. Chuck Berry almost single-handedly transformed rhythm and blues, gospel, and the Delta sound to rock and roll. What we know today is rock and roll. And Eddie said, you got to go through that stage. Every great guitarist has gone through the Chuck Berry stage in order to get to the next stage, which is you're playing your own style. You create your own inventive voice of expression through your instrument, and you innovate. Now that framework stayed with me for the rest of my life. I still follow it, and it gives me guidance to help me determine where am I playing now? Am I at the translational stage? Am I transforming? Am I innovating? And that's the basis of the T3 framework for innovation. There are 3 distinct stages, and we're stuck in stage 1, I think, translational technology use, where we're simply adding technology and 21st century frosting on a 20th century donut. That's why the impact is so low. We need to go through another stage where we're transforming. If we just translate, we're not going to get the gains we want. If we're transforming, there are two elements: production and contribution. That puts the student as the focus of the use of technology. And frankly, when students are more involved in planning for their learning, expressing and representing what they know, what they can do, and how they got there, is fundamentally transformational. When students then use their learning to teach someone what they now know and use digital tools to represent that learning to elicit understanding from someone else, the student becomes the teacher. And they're their own learning sensei. They learn how they learn best by having deep conversations about the strategies they applied at surface learning, deeper learning, and knowledge transfer. The next stage is transcendent technology use. And that's where learners can harness amazing coding environments and learning tools to not only create new learning experiences, but entirely new environments. New tools and applications that are ways to solve wicked problems that matter to them. See, I think we should stop asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And instead ask, what wicked problem matters to you? And what are you going to do about it? The good news is there's no shortage of wicked problems that kids care about. The bad news is there's no shortage of wicked problems that kids care about. Giving kids an opportunity to struggle with ill-structured, ill-defined, unresolved problems is how we create new cultures of innovation. And students then see that their learning is not an end to itself, but a means to an end, a means to making the world a better place and being a contributive member of a global, interdependent world. That changes everything. When we get to the transcendent level, our entire system of education will fundamentally be completely different. Now, the strategies in my T3 framework, I work with Robert Marzano. He's a co-author of my first book. I'm a Marzano research associate. I also have the great honor of working with John Hattie. And the strategies in my little framework were observed and have an effect size not of 0.3, but of 1.6. 1.6 is an extraordinarily large effect size. It is tantamount to a quadrupling of student achievement. So when I ask you to imagine what doubling achievement might look like, I'm kind of understanding. Because we can quadruple achievement. Now, some of you may think, well, but we're a high-performing school. Our kids are performing really well. We don't really need to double achievement. Well, think of it not just in terms of quantity, but time. Because if you double achievement, another way of looking at that is it takes a child half as long to master content. Over time, as schools have been implementing the T3 framework, they've gained more time in the instructional day to invest in the transcendent learning, which is wonderful. So for the next 2 days, I'm going to be doing a series of workshops on understanding the elements, the strategies, and the details of this framework. And it's not terribly difficult. You know, there's no magic bullet. But I think there's a magic sequence. A sequence of strategies, when applied, can really unleash student learning. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of these people who have observed and analyzed my work. They've peer-reviewed the T3 framework. They peer-reviewed my book. This is one of my favorites, actually. Alan November calls me an innovation Sherpa, which is great because I'm actually a mountaineer, so it works out really well for me. And John Hattie reviewed my work and said, the T3 framework, it's credible, it's powerful and exciting, let's do it. And I invite you to join the thousands of other educators around the world that have taken the T3 challenge, learning about how to apply these strategies to unleash that potential in schools. I'm also really honored as a simple biology teacher that my work was just recently inducted into the University of Oxford's Research Encyclopedia for Education. So it was peer-reviewed by the highest level. And now that's available for, if you're interested in looking at my methods and replicating it or being a research partner, I encourage you to do so. My next question is, what's your next step? Now that you've seen this, now that you're thinking about country roads, rocking out, or innovating, what's the next thing you're going to do to unleash your students' innate desire to apply their learning masterfully to make the world a better place? And the first step is imagine. So consider that imagination as the most powerful thing we could do. Imagine what it looks like and imagine what those steps might be. Well, I thank you very much for your time. I look forward to seeing you in the workshops. It's a great conference. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to you. Cheers.